Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome again to Syriana Analysis. I'm your host, Kirk Almasian. So, what's the biggest event in Syria that happened this week? As I mentioned yesterday, the foreign minister of Saudi Arabia paid an official visit to Syria and he met with President Bashar al-Assad. And from the reports that followed this meeting, I would say the meeting was positive because the state media of Syria and those who are affiliated with the Syrian government, and similarly in the Saudi side, I've seen positive input in the newspapers and the media outlets. But in order to further elaborate on this issue, I'm today joined by Giorgio Cafiero. He is the CEO of Gulf State Analytics and fellow at America's Security Project. Thank you so much, Giorgio, for being my guest again for the second time. I truly appreciate your analysis on social media and also the analysis that you publish in different outlets. And I think it presents a comprehensive insight for the people who want to understand both sides of the story. So I'm thankful for you for being my guest again.
Well, thank you so much. It's really an honor to be back on your show.
Thank you, Giorgio. Actually, like the Saudi foreign minister visited Damascus, he met with President Assad on Tuesday. Prince Farhan Al Saud said, "Kingdom is keen to restore Syria or Syria to its Arabic neighborhood." How do you explain this policy shift from actively promoting regime change in Syria to shaking hands with Assad? And I would like to mention one information that I posted 2 days ago that in 2013, Bandar bin Sultan, when he was the head of the Saudi intelligence, they were planning to conquer the palace, the People's Palace, where Assad works. And we all knew what could happen, like in Gaddafi, like what happened with Gaddafi. So how this shift happened between 2013 and 2023 in one decade?
You're absolutely right to bring up the fact that at some of the earliest stages of the conflict in Syria, Saudi Arabia, along with some other regional and international actors, were major sponsors of different armed groups that were fighting to overthrow the Syrian government. And at that time, Saudi Arabia believed it was in the kingdom's interest to push for regime change in Damascus and to try to help start a post-Assad, a post-Ba'athist era in Syria. But to get to your question, what explains the shift? Well, I think the Saudi leadership is being pretty pragmatic about the situation in Syria. The efforts aimed at toppling Assad definitely failed, and Bashar al-Assad is not going anywhere anytime soon. And the Saudis have to sort of contend with the reality of the Syrian government's survival. And I think they're simply just trying to make the best of the situation. Yes, there's a tremendous amount of pride swallowing that goes on. It was, I think, only 7 years ago when Saudi Arabia's top diplomat firmly said Assad must go. And now the current chief diplomat of Saudi Arabia was, as you mentioned, just in Damascus meeting Assad. So I think the Saudis are doing this for numerous reasons, and maybe we'll get into this in a little more depth later in this discussion. But I think one of the main goals that Saudi Arabia has right now is to try to sort of bring Syria back into the Arab region's diplomatic fold and to try to bring Syria closer to the orbits of influence of Saudi Arabia and some other Arab states. And this is part of an effort of sort of halting Iranian influence in Syria. Whether this is a realistic agenda or not is maybe a point we can get to later. But in Saudi Arabia, there really is a determination to try to shore up the Syrian government and to try to use the influence that Saudi Arabia has to maybe pull Syria back a little bit from Iran.
Actually, this is a very important point that you mentioned, the role of Iran or the influence of Iran in Syria. And I truly believe when there is an existential threat, for example, or when there was an existential threat against the Syrian government, the Syrian regime, call it whatever you want, the government goes more into the side of Iran. So whenever there is a security threat or a military threat against the government, we see that Syria is sliding more and more on the side of Iran. And this is an unhealthy situation in the Middle East, where Syria played a role of a mediator or balancing force between different powers. Yes, Syria had a strategic relationship with Iran, but at the same time, it had good relations with different powers: Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey. So different players were also having good relations with Syria at the same time. Now, after 2011, this has changed. And one of the reasons, and I'm not only blaming like regional powers, but one of the reasons was that the government felt cornered. The government in Syria felt like there is a regime change project coming against the leadership, right, in Damascus. And who else would come for military help? Like it's Iran, Hezbollah, and Russia. Those were the forces. So nowadays we see in Syria, yes, growing Iranian influence, and I'm not saying this is negative or positive, but the healthy thing for Syria as a geopolitical smaller regional power, let's say, in the region, is to have good relations with its neighbors, regardless whether they're Saudis or Iranians. But the Saudis in 2012 they severed the diplomatic relations with Damascus, quoting government violence against peaceful protesters. However, Saudi Arabia, in the era that preceded the anti-government protests in Syria, was concerned by Syria's policy in the region, such as its relations with Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, etc. Like, has Syria resolved the Saudi concerns, and what are the acceptable compromises for Riyadh? Because some of the experts nowadays say that Syria didn't compromise, and this is not a win-win situation, but it's just a win situation for Syria because Syria didn't give any concessions to the Saudi side.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's important to maybe go back in history a little bit when there was the Iranian Revolution in 1979 that led to this very close partnership between Syria and Iran. And but nonetheless, during those years, Hafiz al-Assad always worked very hard to balance Syria's partnerships with Iran and the Arab monarchies of the Gulf. What happened when his son took power in 2000 and in the years that followed, especially with the Israel Hezbollah war of 2006, we saw Syria moving much more toward Iran. So that was a trend. That was some movement that was already in play before 2011. But as you correctly point out, once the crisis took place in 2011, and you had countries such as Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey rather aggressively supporting the Syrian opposition, it was very easy to understand how that pushed Damascus much closer to Iran. And, you know, this is a big question that people are asking right now in GCC countries. This is something many people are talking about, is what are the moves that Saudi Arabia and other GCC states could make to try to influence Assad and maybe bring him away from Iran and from Hezbollah. I disagree with some of my friends and colleagues in GCC countries on this point. I am not one who believes that it will be very easy for GCC members such as Saudi Arabia to take actions right now that could fundamentally change Syria's relationship with Iran. We can't act like the past 12 years didn't happen. The past 12 years did a lot to shape the role that Iran plays in Syria. Today, Iran has a tremendous amount of influence in the war-torn country. Iran's influence is very entrenched, whether we're talking about different militias that Iran supports in Syria or the Iranian role in Syria's economy. This is not something that will be easy for any Arab state to change. Of course, over the long haul, things can change, but throughout the upcoming future, I don't, again, people have some different views than I do on this, but I just don't see the GCC states really succeeding, at least anytime soon, in terms of halting Iran's influence in Syria.
Hmm. Giorgio, do you agree with the argument or the analysis that says Syria is holding the card of Iran as a bargain chip with the United States? Like, if the Americans withdraw from Syria, the Iranian side could also withdraw with its military groups on the ground that supports.
Well, I mean, Iran has a lot of leverage. I don't think it's just simply a decision that the Syrian government can make to have the Iranians leave Syria. Iran has its own interests in Syria, and I think obviously as this tension between Israel and Iran dangerously heats up, the strategic value of Syria to Iran is huge. And I also think we should point out that the Assad government absolutely does not trust the United States. The Assad government got very close to Iran, and during the years in which the Syrian government's survival was in question, Iran made huge sacrifices to help the Assad government stay in power. And this is not something that anyone in Damascus is going to forget anytime soon. So I think I just don't see that kind of scenario as very likely, whereby in exchange for the U.S. leaving Syria, the Assad government has the Iranians leave. I just have a difficult time imagining that, to be honest.
Yeah. But since you mentioned Israel, what's the position of Israel in respect to the rapprochement between first Syria, Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia and Iran in this regard? I've seen some nervous reactions, let's say, on in the media and the press. But is it really the truth? Like, are they really nervous in Israel, or they're pretending to object such reconciliation in the region?
Well, let's go back to the March 10 diplomatic agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran that certainly terrified the Israelis. And we should point out Israel was the only state in the Middle East that objected to that diplomatic agreement. All the other governments in the region welcomed it immediately and saw the agreement as, uh, paving the way, potentially paving the way to major de-escalations in the Middle East. Israel, for many years, has looked to GCC states such as Saudi Arabia as countries that are sort of natural partners in the struggle against expanding and consolidating Iranian influence. And I definitely don't think that Iran is the only reason why Israel and the UAE, as well as Israel and Bahrain, normalized diplomatic relations in 2020. But it absolutely was a big factor, I would say, especially in the case of Bahrain. Um, so this recent development, whereby Riyadh and Tehran resume diplomatic relations, it forces the Israelis to call into question, how serious Gulf Arab states are about sort of partnering with Israel against Iran. A point I'll add is that the GCC states understand that if there were to be an all out hot war between Israel and Iran, and if they were to be seen from Iran's perspective as supporting Israel, whether through giving them airspace or supporting in other ways, it would be very easy for Iran to lash out against GCC states in ways that would be very devastating to their national security and their economic health. We all remember the Aramco attacks of September 2019. So I think the GCC states, in this case Saudi Arabia, are being very pragmatic in terms of how they deal with Iran. They just want to make sure that if there's going to be a conflict between Israel and Iran, that they don't get caught up in it. Now, to shift to this
Hmm.
question about how Israel views the Arab region's trend toward normalization with Damascus, I don't think this is something that Israel welcomes so much. Um, Going back before 2011, before Syria was bogged down in its own internal crises, Syria was really the last Arab state that remained confrontational in the Arab Israeli conflict. And a strong Syria that's stable and united is something that Israel has long feared. And I think, obviously, um, when Syria was bogged down in its internal crisis beginning in 2011, that was seen as something very positive from the Israeli perspective. Because with Syria fighting the civil war at home, it was not in a position to really put serious pressure on Israel. So now there's this these moves on the part of countries such as the UAE and many others to try to shore up the Syrian government and to help Syria move past this conflict that's plagued the country for the past 12 years. And I definitely don't think the Israelis welcome that, because there's potential at some point down the line, maybe when the U.S. lifts sanctions or sort of loosens them, that these countries could invest in Syria and help the country regrow. And again, that's not something that Israel wants to see happen in Syria.
I just want to raise a question here because I find a hard time to understand this. For example, many Syrian opposition figures, they say if Israel wanted Assad to be gone, he would have gone long time ago. It's Israel that kept the situation in Syria in a way that Assad would stay in the country and not be replaced by an opposition, let's say, or a group of opposition figures in the country. If we calculate, let's say, the pros and cons from the Israeli perspective in Syria, do you think Israel would prefer for Assad to stay or to be replaced? And we're not only talking about 2023, but if we go a little bit back when the hostilities were very, let's say, severe between the Syrian army and the different armed groups in the country, had Israel had the interest for Assad to go, or for the conflict just to be prolonged and nobody wins in the country, or for the opposition to come to power, in your opinion?
Great question. So yes, early on at the start of the Syrian crisis, Israeli leadership joined Western countries and some regional countries in saying Assad must go. Yes, that's true. But at the same time, there are many people who said that the actual interests of Israel were a little bit different. You know, the saying goes, "Better the devil you know than the devil you don't." And given that since 1973, the Syrian-Israeli border was a quiet frontier, there were many Israelis who argued that yes, we have big problems with Assad and his government, but at the same time, there are so many unknown variables about what could possibly emerge in a post-Assad era that we don't have an interest in seeing to it that the Syrian president or the Syrian government fall. I think there's a lot of logic to that. So my assessment is that Israel did not necessarily want Assad to fall, but they wanted him to be very weak and to be constantly focused on an internal crisis inside Syria that would prevent the country from building up its forces and being able to put some real pressure on Israel. Also today, with two major outside actors having the most influence inside Syria, that being Iran and Russia, I think Israel's interest is in seeing to it that if Assad is going to stay, that his country is much more under the umbrella of Moscow rather than under the umbrella of Tehran. I think Israel is not necessarily concerned about the survival of Assad per se, but their concern has to do with the ways in which the Assad government will be allying with Iran throughout the future.
But Giorgio, don't you think after 1973 war, it was apparent or quite clear for Syria that they cannot reclaim Golan Heights in a military means? Let's say that's why there was this phase of, um, I would say, truce. A non-declared truce between both sides, but at the same time, Syria under Assad harmed Israeli security interests in the region through non-state actors such as Hezbollah and Hamas. So Syria simply changed the character or the nature of the conflict with Israel from a direct confrontation that the last time was, I think, in 1982 in Lebanon, into a proxy warfare against Israel through non-state actors, so that Syria would spare, I would say, direct confrontation with a country that they cannot defeat due to different considerations. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Syria didn't have an international backer. Nowadays, Russia has very good relations with Israel. And Arabic countries also now, let's say, normalizing relations with Israel. It's like Syria has been left alone in the Arabic world. I would say I'm excluding Iran right now.
Yeah, it's a good point you make, and again, it goes back to something I said earlier that for many years, Syria has been the only Arab state that's actually confrontational toward Israel. While many Arab states have officials whose rhetoric is very pro Palestinian, they go before the UN and they condemn Israel. At the end of the day, Syria was really the only Arab state that was actually giving money and bullets to militias like Hezbollah in Lebanon or Hamas in Gaza and maybe some other ones too that were actually engaged in directly fighting Israel. And that contributes, obviously, that contributes to the Israeli perception of the Assad government as an enemy and as a threat. But at the same time, given the unknowns of what could have possibly emerged had Assad fallen, the Israelis were very concerned about those questions. And at the end of the day, the Syrian government, whatever you think of it, I'm not here to excuse crimes committed by the Syrian government, but it is a rational actor. And the Israelis understand that Assad and the people around him conduct foreign policy in a manner which is rational. In the event that the Syrian state would collapse and you would have many different statelets in the country run by extremist militias, it's not so clear that there would be a rational actor governing Syria. So I think for that reason, what Israel wanted was not to see to it that Assad would fall and the country would disintegrate in across many different lines with different militias controlling different areas, but to see to it that the Syrian government would be very weak and would be very bogged down, and that Syrians would be killing each other rather than being able to focus on confronting Israel.
Mm-hmm. Now, if I want to ask you about the United States, do you think this rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Syria is considered a blow to the US in the region, or it's coordinated with Washington?
Well, my personal view is that the Saudi Iran diplomatic agreement is good news for everyone, including the United States. However, many people in Washington have a very different assessment. And we saw Burns go over to Saudi Arabia, and we also saw Senator Lindsey Graham go to Saudi Arabia to express their concerns about the reconciliation between Saudi Arabia and Iran.
Isn't he the one who said that he would never visit Saudi Arabia as long as MBS is in power?
Yeah, he did say that, I
Yeah.
think in 2018. So that's ancient history now. Um, but yeah, the fact of the matter is this diplomatic agreement was a big diplomatic win for China. And anytime China is going to have a big diplomatic gain in the Middle East, that's going to alarm the diplomatic establishment in Washington, which is concerned about China's deepening relationships with Arab states that have historically been aligned with the West, such as the UAE in Saudi Arabia. There's also another factor here too, is that Saudi Arabia resuming diplomatic relations with Iran serves to ease the pressure that is on the Islamic Republic, and it serves to make Iran much less of an isolated country inside the Middle East. And the U.S. has for years been pursuing maximum pressure. That's what it was called under Trump. In my opinion, the policies haven't really changed that much under Biden. Okay, there's now we have a U.S. envoy to Iran. There's maybe a little bit more of a diplomatic approach, but at the end of the day, the U.S. is still strangling Iran with sanctions as part of a pressure campaign. And now, with the Saudi minister last month talking about the kingdom making very large investments in Iran very quickly, it becomes pretty clear to Washington that Saudi Arabia might not be a useful partner anymore when it comes to pressuring Iran, at least
Hmm.
not in the ways that many officials in the US had previously understood. Um, Now, there is some irony here. It was only a few years ago when Saudi Arabia was lobbying the US to impose maximum pressure on Iran. So I obviously want to point that factor out, which I think is important. But yeah, and nonetheless, with the reconciliation between Riyadh and Tehran, the pressure has been lessening on Iran. And I think many people in Washington are concerned that that's going to make Iran more confident in the region. And then, of course, when it comes to Saudi Arabia and other Arab states renormalizing relations with Assad's government, that infuriates people in Washington. The U.S. position is that Assad lost his legitimacy. The U.S. does not want to see Arab states welcoming Assad back in from the cold after 12 years of being relatively isolated in the region. And I stress relatively isolated because there were a host of Arab countries that never cut off diplomatic relations with Syria. But there were many that did, and that put pressure on Assad. And now that pressure is lessening because you have many Arab states that are welcoming Syrian officials to their capitals. They're sending their diplomats to Damascus. Since March 2022, Assad has visited the Gulf 3 times, visiting the UAE and also the Sultanate of Oman. And I don't think the US is going to do much about this, but there's no doubt that it creates a lot of anger in Washington.
Giorgio, not only the neocons are frustrated, I would say those who are in positions of power in Washington, but also some experts or those who call themselves experts on Syria. They're really frustrated and they're showing hysterical attitude, especially on social media platforms after the Arabic rapprochement with Syria, and they're pushing for hostility, let's say, between these countries. You're also an analyst. You're also publishing in different outlets. What's the difference between an analyst or a publisher or a journalist or an expert who welcomes rapprochement in the region and someone who is showing an hysterical attitude and calling for the continuation of the hostilities in the region? Do these experts really benefit financially or any other way from the continuation of conflict in the region?
Well, I think there are some analysts who try to see the region from the perspective of local actors. I think it's fine for people to criticize, the UAE or other countries for renormalizing with Syria, but it's important to understand why those governments believe it's in their interest to do so. These countries are renormalizing with Syria for various reasons. They think that giving Syria the North Korea treatment and leaving Syria as sort of a North Korea on the Mediterranean is not going to serve the interests of the Syrian people nor the interests of the wider Arab world. They also are moving closer to Russia due to the reality of a more multipolar world in which US influence is decreasing and Russia, really beginning in 2015 with its military intervention in Syria, has established itself as an important player in the Middle East. Their renormalization path with Syria does relate to their relationships with Russia. And again, I think it's fair for people to question or criticize these decisions to renormalize with Damascus. But what I find a little frustrating from many people in Washington is the either an inability or sort of a refusal to at least consider the fact that these are sovereign nation states. These are not U.S. puppets. GCC states don't just take orders from the United States. They're pursuing their interests in a more multipolar world, and they have a right to do so as independent countries. And I think that many people in Washington think that because of all the support that the U.S. has given GCC states over the years, and by the way, it's really a two-way street. GCC states have also supported the US in many ways too. But I think there's a mindset in Washington that
Yes.
because these countries in the Gulf depend on the US security umbrella, that they shouldn't ever move too far away from sort of US foreign policy agendas and foreign policy interests. And just to add to that, I think an attitude that you have in the Arab region right now, whether we're talking about Jordan, UAE, Bahrain, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Tunisia, Algeria, so on, is that there's a need to sort of look forward when it comes to Syria
Hmm.
and not make everything that happened in the past 12 years define everything that happens in the future. Now, there's not a consensus in the Arab world on this. In the Gulf, you have Qatar and Kuwait, which do not buy
Yes.
into these arguments in favor of renormalization. They believe that what has happened over the past 12 years cost Assad his legitimacy, and they do not want to renormalize with Damascus. But these countries are definitely in the minority among Arab League members. The trend among Arab states is to try to find ways to um, mend fences with Assad and to try to influence Syria in ways that would serve their interests and to look ahead to a reconstruction and redevelopment phase rather than looking to the past.
I think there is a beautiful Arabic saying, and we're not promoting any violence, dear YouTube, but it says, "If you can't cut the hand of your enemy, shake the hands of your enemy." And I think also diplomacy is always it's a battle, but it's a different type of battle, and it would be really better if also Qatar and other countries join the diplomatic club, let's say, in the region. And at the end of the day, the legitimacy of Assad should be decided by the people. I'm for reforms in Syria, political reforms, democratizing this political system further in the country for freedom of press. And I would be, as a Syrian, someone I would benefit from it, right? It's in my interest for my country to become more progressive and more, I would say, democratic. However, when we have good economic relations between different countries in the region, or economic integration between these Arabic countries, the possibility and the chances for similar proxy warfares, regime change wars will also diminish. So I'm really an advocate for reconciliation between the Arabic countries. We also in Syria, we have very harsh feelings towards Saudi Arabia, towards Qatar. They also have to see this from our perspective, that we perceive this as a regime change war or a foreign warfare on our territories, and we've seen tens of thousands of foreign jihadists committing horrendous war crimes in our country. We lost people that we know from our family or friends. So it's also two-sided, right? We also have this harsh feeling toward these countries, but there is no permanent enmity in politics. And to be honest, if this policy continues of enmity between these countries, another 100,000 people could die in Syria. So I don't understand the argument. Even the pro-government people in Syria now who say we don't want to reconcile with the Gulf countries. No, we must reconcile with the Gulf countries, and we must reconcile with Turkey. We must reconcile with these strong regional countries, because Syria is not an island. It has neighbors, and we need these neighbors in our economic affairs and even on social level, and they can play an important role, especially Saudi Arabia as a very strong Sunni power in the region. And if Saudi Arabia joins this serious diplomatic efforts also to create an atmosphere in the country to make a social reconciliation, because beside, in parallel of these regional reconciliation processes, we need reconciliation between Syrians. And there are so many Syrians nowadays in Turkey, 3.5 million Syrians. Vast majority of them do not trust the Syrian government. Vast majority of them, they fear the Syrian government. They think if they go back to Syria, they will be hanged or they will be killed, etc., etc. So this needs to be on a different levels: political level, media level, and also social level and religious level, right? Because religion plays an instrumental role also in the region. So I'm positive. I'm optimistic with these reconciliation processes, and I hope other Arabic countries also join these processes. But till then, I would like to thank you, Giorgio, for joining me again today on Syrian Analysis. It's always a pleasure to have you and listen to your perspective. You are the CEO of Gulf State Analytics and also a fellow at American Security Project. Guys, I put his Twitter link in the description below. Please go and follow him and his work. It's very important to listen to different perspectives and always have discussion because discussion only brings us on a higher level of intellect, and this is why I created Syrian Analysis. Thank you, Giorgio.
The pleasure is all mine. Thank you so much.
And guys, thank you very much for watching this show. If you're new, please subscribe, hit the like button, and all these things that YouTubers say usually. And if you want to support my independent work, please become a patron. Link in the description below. And see you next time.